The compass spun in helpless circles, its needle drunk on something the desert wouldn't name. Jack Thompson's weathered hands shook the instrument, cursing under his breath as the metal casing caught the dying light of a New Mexico sunset that had painted the canyon walls the color of dried blood. Magnetic anomaly, he muttered to no one, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. But even as he spoke, Jack knew this wasn't science. This was something else entirely, something that made the air hum with electricity and turned the familiar landscape into foreign territory where shadows fell upward and roses bloomed in sand. The trail twisted ahead like a serpent's spine, leading down through jagged rocks that had watched centuries pass in silence. Jack's unit moved single file behind him. Corporal Ramos with his rosary beads clicking softly against his rifle, Private Pierce clutching that plastic Virgin Mary statue like a talisman, 3 other soldiers whose names would be forgotten but whose witness would echo through decades of whispered stories. The scent hit him first. Roses in a place where no roses grew, sweet and impossible, carried on desert wind that had been bone-dry moments before. Jack's boot found loose shale. Time fragmented into sharp-edged moments. The shout from behind, the world tilting sideways, 40 feet of empty air rushing past, and then the sound of bone meeting stone with a wet crack that made the desert itself seem to flinch. Darkness swallowed him whole. Don't forget to hit like, drop a comment below, and subscribe so you never miss the next story waiting in the shadows. When consciousness returned, Jack found himself staring up at a canopy of stars so bright they seemed close enough to pluck. His right leg lay twisted beneath him, bone jutting through fabric soaked in blood that looked black in the moonlight. The pain should have been unbearable, but what filled his awareness instead was presence, something vast and patient and unutterably compassionate watching him from the darkness between the stars. She stood where no one should have been able to stand, on a ledge of rock that hadn't existed when he fell. Blue robes the color of midnight sky, sown with light that didn't come from any earthly source. Her face held the serene sorrow of mothers who have watched their children suffer and die, who have stood at the foot of crosses and cradled the bodies of the innocent. The Virgin Mary, Mariam, the woman whose name Jack Thompson had turned into a punchline, whose image he had mocked, whose followers he had ridiculed with the casual cruelty of a man who had never needed anyone's mercy. In her hands, she held a single white rose. Jack tried to speak, to scream, to move, but found himself held in a silence so complete it seemed to exist outside of time itself. The woman in blue began to descend, her feet touching stone that should have crumbled under any weight, her presence filling the gully with light that cast no shadows. When she knelt beside him, Jack could smell roses and something else, something like his mother's perfume on the rare occasions when she had dressed for church, back when hope still lived in their Detroit tenement, before whiskey and despair had killed it slowly. The Virgin's eyes held no accusation, no anger, no demand for apology. Only love so profound it made Jack weep without understanding why. She placed the rose on his chest, her fingers brushing his dog tags with a touch gentle as prayer, and whispered words in a language his mind couldn't grasp, but his heart understood perfectly. "Come home to me, my son." Light exploded behind his eyelids. The desert held its breath. And somewhere in the distance, a helicopter's rotors began to thunder through the night, racing toward a miracle that medics would never be able to explain. 3 days earlier, in the sweltering heat of a December afternoon that had no business being so warm, Jack Thompson stood in the town square of Esperanza watching Mexican families prepare for the Feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe with the detached amusement of an anthropologist studying primitive rituals. Children in white robes carried armfuls of roses, their small faces grave with the importance of their task. Grandmothers knelt on stone that must have been agony for their arthritic joints, lighting candles with hands that shook from age but never wavered in faith. Young men carried a statue of the Virgin through the narrow streets, their shoulders bent under weight that seemed both physical and spiritual. The scene should have moved him, should have reminded him of something beautiful about human nature, about the persistence of hope in the face of hardship. Instead, Jack found himself calculating tactical weaknesses, how the crowds would scatter if gunfire erupted, which buildings offered the best cover, where an enemy sniper might position himself among the bell towers and adobe walls. This was what 18 years in the Marines had done to him. Turned every gathering into a potential battleground, every celebration into a security assessment, every moment of human joy into a problem to be solved with superior firepower and situational awareness. "Look at this circus," he said to Corporal Miller, who stood beside him chewing gum with the mechanical rhythm of a man trying to stay awake after 36 hours without sleep. "They're acting like she's going to walk down Main Street and pay their mortgages." Miller shrugged, his attention focused more on the women in traditional dresses than on Jack's commentary. "Different strokes, Sergeant. My grandmother used to drag me to Mass every Sunday. Can't say it hurt me any." Jack snorted. "Can't say it helped either, or you'd be in officer candidate school instead of babysitting tourists in this desert shithole." The words came easier now than they had 20 years ago, when Jack was 12 and still believed prayers might be answered if you asked nicely enough. Back then, he had knelt beside his bed every night, whispering desperate bargains with a God who never seemed to be listening. "Please make Mama stop drinking. Please make the electricity work. Please make the scary men stop coming to the door." None of those prayers had been answered. Not one. And by the time Jack turned 15, he had learned the most important lesson of his youth. You couldn't count on anyone or anything except your own two hands and whatever weapon you could find to put in them. His mother had been beautiful once. Jack kept a photograph hidden in his wallet that proved it, showing a young woman with dark hair and eyes full of hope standing outside a church in a wedding dress that probably came from goodwill, but looked like it could have belonged to a princess. But hope was a luxury she couldn't afford for long in the kind of neighborhood where factories closed without warning and fathers disappeared without explanation, leaving behind nothing but empty bottles and unpaid bills. By the time Jack was old enough to understand what was happening, Diane Thompson had become a ghost haunting her own apartment, shuffling between the laundromat where she worked double shifts and the corner liquor store where she spent what little money she managed to keep from the landlord and the bill collectors. The only religious artifact in their home was a plastic crucifix hanging above the stove, its surface blackened by grease and neglect, its Christ figure barely visible beneath years of accumulated grime. "That's just something your grandmother left behind," his mother had said when Jack asked about it once. Her voice carried the flat exhaustion of someone who had been disappointed too many times to risk hoping again. "Don't mean nothing now. Don't mean nothing now." That phrase had become Jack's personal theology, his answer to every moment of beauty or transcendence or mystery that tried to crack open the armor he had built around his heart. The sunset over Lake Huron? Don't mean nothing now. The way snow fell silent on Christmas morning? Don't mean nothing now. The tears in his drill instructor's eyes when he read the letter about his son being killed in Afghanistan? Don't mean nothing now. Boot camp had only sharpened that edge, turning Jack's cynicism into a weapon as reliable as his rifle. The Corps didn't want philosophers or mystics. It wanted killers who could follow orders without questioning the cost in human suffering. Jack excelled at both requirements, earning commendations for marksmanship and tactical thinking while maintaining the kind of emotional distance that made him effective in situations where sentiment could get people killed. He became that guy, the one with a sarcastic answer for every moment of vulnerability, every display of faith, every glimpse of something larger than the narrow confines of military life. When Corporal Ramos prayed the rosary before night patrols, Jack would make jokes about magical thinking and superstition. When Private Pierce showed pictures of his grandmother's shrine to Our Lady of Perpetual Help, Jack would ask if she took requests for lottery numbers. "Hey, Martinez," he had called across the training ground at Fort Bragg, watching a young recruit kiss a scapula before a live fire exercise. "Ask your holy lady if she's got earplugs for this next blast." The laughter that followed felt like validation, proof that Jack's worldview was not only correct, but popular. Other soldiers began coming to him for the kind of crude jokes and blasphemous observations that helped them maintain emotional distance from the fears that kept them awake at night. He became a kind of chaplain in reverse, offering doubt instead of comfort, cynicism instead of hope. But there were moments, quiet moments when he thought no one was watching, when the mask slipped just enough to reveal the loneliness beneath. Late at night in his bunk, staring at the ceiling while other men snored or whispered to girlfriends on forbidden cell phones, Jack would find himself remembering things he had tried to forget. His mother singing lullabies in Spanish she had learned from her own mother, the way church bells sounded on Sunday mornings when the city was still quiet, the expression on his grandmother's face when she prayed in the tiny bedroom she had shared with his mother before the cancer took her. Those memories hurt worse than any physical wound Jack had ever received, because they reminded him of a time when he had been capable of believing in something beyond survival, when his heart had been soft enough to break instead of just growing harder with each disappointment. So he buried them deeper, surrounded them with barbed wire made of jokes and sarcasm, and the kind of aggressive atheism that dared the universe to prove him wrong. Every time someone mentioned miracles or prayer or the possibility of divine intervention, Jack was there with a cutting remark designed to puncture their hope before it could infect him with its dangerous optimism. The pattern continued through 3 deployments and 2 decades of service. Jack became known as the guy who could make anyone laugh at anything, no matter how sacred or precious or meaningful it might be to someone else. He collected blasphemies like other soldiers collected medals, each one a small victory in his private war against the possibility that there might be something in the universe worth believing in. And then he found himself in Esperanza, watching Mexican families prepare for a feast day dedicated to a woman whose name he had turned into a punchline, whose image he had mocked, whose followers he had ridiculed with the casual cruelty of someone who had never needed anyone's mercy. The old man appeared as if materialized from the desert heat itself, his brown jacket faded to the color of adobe walls, his face carved into lines that spoke of decades spent working under an unforgiving sun. But it was his eyes that stopped Jack's commentary mid-sentence. Eyes that seemed to hold depths of knowledge that had nothing to do with education or experience, and everything to do with a kind of sight that Jack had spent his entire adult life trying to convince himself didn't exist. The man stepped closer than Jack liked strangers to get, close enough that Jack could smell the scent of sage and candle wax that seemed to cling to his clothes like incense. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had never needed to raise his voice to be heard. "You mock what you do not understand, soldier." Jack's hand instinctively moved toward his sidearm, not out of genuine threat, but from the kind of muscle memory that had kept him alive in places where mockery could get you killed. But something about the old man's posture, patient, sorrowful, utterly without fear, made him pause. "When I need help," Jack said, leaning forward with the kind of aggressive body language designed to establish dominance, "I'll call base command, not some statue in a blue dress." The old man didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't show any of the intimidation that Jack's size and bearing usually generated in civilians. He simply nodded with the kind of sadness that seemed to encompass not just Jack's words, but the entire history of human beings choosing mockery over wonder, cynicism over hope. "One day, soldier, you will call for her," he said, his voice so quiet Jack had to strain to hear it over the sound of children singing in the distance. "I just hope it won't be too late." Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of families and pilgrims as if he had never been there at all, leaving Jack standing in the plaza with a growing unease that he couldn't name and wouldn't acknowledge, even to himself. That night, back at the temporary base they had established in a converted warehouse on the outskirts of town, Jack told the story like a joke to anyone who would listen. "Some old dude tried to scare me with ghost stories," he said, accepting the beer that Corporal Miller handed him from their illicit stash. "Said I'd be needing his virgin Barbie one day." The laughter came on cue, but it sounded forced even to Jack's ears. And later, lying on his cot with the desert wind rattling the corrugated metal walls, He found himself staring at shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources, listening to sounds that might have been voices carrying on air that smelled, impossibly, of roses. 3 days into patrol in the Sierra Blanca canyons, Private Pierce bent to fix his gear and rose with a rosary in his hand, worn beads that hadn't been there before. Jack dismissed it as desert wind, though they were miles from any trail and the rosary looked untouched by weather. That night, Jack heard Pierce whispering prayers in the dark. The next morning, every radio died at once. Batteries were full, circuits fine, but silence ruled the air. 3 days later, the equipment mysteriously worked again. Jack muttered about solar flares, though he didn't believe it. Then came the dream. Corporal Ramos woke drenched in sweat, swearing he'd seen a woman in blue robes standing in ash, her gaze piercing every wrong he'd ever done. Jack pretended it was dehydration, but he too had been dreaming of songs, roses, and light with no source. That evening, the impossible scent of roses filled camp for 13 seconds before vanishing. Compasses soon followed, spinning uselessly as if the desert itself had abandoned natural law. Jack clung to talk of magnetic anomalies, though the words rang hollow. On the 5th night, he woke to movement outside. In the starlight stood a woman in blue, veil glowing softly, hands folded in patient prayer. Mary. Mariam. Her gaze found him, and he froze, not paralyzed, but overwhelmed by sorrow and love deeper than fear. She raised one hand, turned, and walked beyond rocks that held no hiding place. Jack lay awake until dawn, rational explanations crumbling. By morning, a single white rose rested beside his sleeping bag. Fresh, perfect, impossible. He picked it up, careful of the thorns, and placed it over his heart. The fall came without warning on what had started as a routine descent from the canyon rim, where they had spent 6 days learning that the desert kept its own counsel and operated according to laws that had nothing to do with magnetic north or radio frequencies or the rational materialism that had served Jack Thompson so well in every other environment where he had been asked to demonstrate his competence as a Marine. The trail twisted down through layers of sedimentary rock that told stories spanning millions of years, ancient seas that had covered this land when the continent was young, forests that had flourished and died and been buried under sand and time, creatures whose bones had turned to stone and whose existence could only be inferred from the traces they had left in strata, that geologists read like pages in a book written by forces too vast and patient for human comprehension. Jack led the descent, as he had led countless other missions through terrain that tested equipment and endurance, and the kind of faith in one's own capabilities that military training was designed to instill in young men who would be asked to walk toward gunfire when every instinct screamed at them to run in the opposite direction. His boots found purchase on stone worn smooth by flash floods and winter freezes. His hands gripped rock faces that offered just enough texture to support the weight of a man carrying 60 pounds of equipment and the accumulated skepticism of someone who had spent 2 decades refusing to believe in anything he couldn't verify through empirical observation. Behind him, his unit moved in the careful formation they had perfected through repetition and trust. Ramos second in line with his radio equipment and his quietly whispered prayers. Pierce third with his emergency medical kit and the plastic statue of the Virgin Mary that he thought no one knew he carried. The others following in order of experience and capability, each man responsible for the safety of those ahead and behind him, in the chain of mutual dependence that was the foundational principle of military brotherhood. The white rose rested in Jack's breast pocket, pressed against his heart, impossible to ignore, and equally impossible to explain to anyone who might ask why a career Marine was carrying a flower through country where flowers didn't grow. He had told himself it was evidence, something to be analysed by botanists who might be able to determine its species and origin, proof that there was a rational explanation for events that had tested his understanding of how the world worked. But he had made no effort to preserve it for scientific analysis, hadn't pressed it between pages of a field manual, or sealed it in plastic to protect it from the elements. Instead, he found himself touching it throughout the day, reassured by its presence in ways that made no sense according to the psychological framework he had used to understand his own motivations since childhood. The compass in his hand continued to spin in lazy circles, its needle drunk on magnetic fields that obeyed no earthly logic. Jack had given up trying to navigate by instrument, relying instead on landmark navigation and the kind of terrain reading that had been standard military practice before satellites and GPS systems had made it possible for soldiers to know their exact position within 3 meters anywhere on the planet's surface. It was, he reflected, with the dark humor that had sustained him through situations where humor was the only alternative to panic, like reverting to some earlier version of himself, a more primitive Jack Thompson, who navigated by sun and stars and the shapes of distant mountains, who trusted his senses more than his equipment, who was beginning to accept that there were forces at work in the universe that didn't appear in any technical manual he had ever been required to study. The trail narrowed as it approached a section where ancient water flow had carved a channel through rock formations that rose on either side like the walls of a natural cathedral. Jack had scouted this section the previous day and knew it represented the most technically challenging part of their descent. A steep incline where loose shale overlay solid stone, where a moment's inattention or a single misplaced step could send a man tumbling 40 feet into a gully filled with boulders and thorny plants that would turn a fall into a death sentence. He was thinking about safety protocols and the importance of maintaining proper spacing when his left boot found the loose stone that had been waiting for him with the patience of geological time. The world tilted sideways with the sickening speed of dreams, where falling goes on forever, where the ground rushes up to meet you with malevolent inevitability, where you have just enough time to understand that your life is about to change in ways that can't be undone by apologies or second chances, or desperate bargains with deities you have spent decades denying. Jack's body struck the slope hard, his right leg taking the initial impact with a sound like a branch breaking, then his shoulder, then his head against stone that had no interest in cushioning the collision between human flesh and the immutable laws of physics. He tumbled end over end, his equipment scattering across the rock face, his rifle clattering away into darkness, his body rolling and bouncing and finally coming to rest in a shallow depression that had been carved by water and time into a natural grave. The pain hit him in waves, starting with his leg where bone had punched through muscle and skin in a compound fracture that painted the stone beneath him with blood that looked black in the late afternoon light. Then his shoulder, dislocated or broken, or both. Then his head, where something warm was trickling down his face and pooling in the sand beside his cheek. But worse than the pain was the silence that followed. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something vast and attentive that seemed to be waiting for him to make some crucial decision about how this moment would unfold, what meaning it would carry, whether his story would end here in this desert grave or continue in directions he couldn't yet imagine. Above him, voices called his name with the kind of desperate urgency that meant they could see how badly he was hurt, could see the blood and the unnatural angles of his limbs, and were already calculating how long it would take to get him to medical attention that might or might not be sufficient to save his life. Ramos was on the radio, trying to raise base command through electronic silence that had swallowed their communications like a hungry mouth. Pierce was rappelling down the cliff face with medical supplies and the kind of young man's certainty that determination could substitute for training when lives hung in the balance. But Jack wasn't listening to their voices anymore. His attention had been captured by something else entirely, a presence that filled the gully with light that came from no identifiable source, that illuminated the stone walls and the sparse vegetation and the spreading pool of his own blood with a radiance that felt like sunrise and sunset happening simultaneously, like the moment when darkness gives way to light and everything impossible becomes inevitable. She materialized slowly, as if stepping through a doorway that existed in dimensions he had never learned to perceive. Blue robes the color of deep sky, white veil that moved in wind that touched nothing else, hands that held a single white rose identical to the one resting against his heart. Her face was the face he had seen in his dreams for the past week, the face that had watched him from shadows and starlight, the face of every mother who had ever held a dying child and whispered prayers to forces that might or might not be listening. The Virgin Mary, Mariam, the woman whose name Jack Thompson had turned into blasphemy, whose image he had mocked, whose followers he had ridiculed with the casual cruelty of someone who had never needed mercy and therefore couldn't imagine requiring forgiveness. She knelt beside him in sand that should have shifted under her weight, but didn't, her robes spreading around her like water that had found its own level, her presence filling the air with scent of roses and something else, something clean and pure that reminded Jack of the way his mother's hair had smelled when she still went to church, back when hope was still stronger than despair in the mathematics of their daily survival. "My son," she said, her voice carrying the musical quality of languages Jack had never learned but somehow understood perfectly. "My poor lost son." The words broke something inside Jack's chest, some dam he had built from 30 years of accumulated disappointments and defensive sarcasm and the kind of emotional callus that forms over wounds that never quite heal. Tears began to flow down his cheeks, mixing with blood from the cut on his forehead, carrying away decades of carefully maintained cynicism like water washing salt from a wound. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though he wasn't sure what he was apologizing for. The mockery, the disbelief, the way he had turned her name into a punchline, or simply the stubborn pride that had prevented him from seeing what had been in front of him all along. "I'm so sorry." She reached out and touched his face with fingers that felt real as anything he had ever experienced but left no physical trace of their presence. Her touch carrying comfort that went deeper than nerve endings and muscle tissue to reach places in his soul that had been frozen since childhood. Where her fingers brushed his cheek, the pain receded not because it was taken away, but because it was transformed into something else. Not suffering, but understanding. Not agony, but recognition of the price that love sometimes demanded from those who served it. "You called for me," she said, and Jack realized with surprise that this was true. In the moment when the ground had given way beneath his feet, in the heartbeat between stepping and falling, some part of him had reached out toward forces he had spent his adult life denying, had whispered a prayer to someone he claimed not to believe existed. "I didn't think you'd come," he admitted. "I never left," she replied, her smile carrying the infinite patience of mothers who wait decades for their children to find their way home. "You simply learned how to see." The rose in her hands began to glow with light that had nothing to do with reflection or bioluminescence or any phenomenon that appeared in the textbooks Jack had studied during his brief attempt at college before the military claimed him. She placed it on his chest beside the first rose, and where the flowers touched his torn uniform, the pain began to fade, replaced by warmth that spread through his broken body like water soaking into parched earth. Jack felt bone knitting itself back together beneath skin that sealed without leaving scars, felt muscles and tendons remembering their proper alignment, felt blood that had been flowing out of him, returning to vessels that no longer leaked life onto desert stone. But more profound than the physical healing was something else, a transformation that reached deeper than tissue and bone to touch places in his spirit that had been wounded since childhood, that had been bleeding invisibly for decades while he convinced himself that strength meant never acknowledging pain. "Why?" he whispered, his voice carrying the bewilderment of someone who has spent years earning punishment and receiving mercy instead. "After everything I said. After all the mockery." Her smile held the infinite patience of divine love that doesn't keep score of insults or measure forgiveness according to human concepts of justice and retribution. "Because you are my son," she said simply, "and a mother's love doesn't end when her children lose their way. It grows stronger." Above them, Jack could hear his unit calling his name with increasing desperation, could hear the sound of boots on stone as they rappelled down the cliff face to reach what they expected to find. A broken body that would need immediate evacuation to the nearest trauma center, assuming he had survived the fall at all. He wanted to call out, to let them know he was alive, but found himself held in a moment that existed outside normal time, suspended between the world he had known and a reality that was larger and more mysterious than anything his training had prepared him to encounter. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now you choose," she replied, her hand still resting on his cheek with touch that felt like benediction and homecoming combined. "You can return to the life you knew before, carrying this gift as proof that love is stronger than doubt, that mercy is more powerful than judgment. Or you can let fear convince you this was hallucination brought on by trauma and blood loss." Jack understood that she was offering him a way out, an escape clause that would let him return to his comfortable cynicism, his carefully constructed worldview where miracles didn't happen, and divine intervention was just wishful thinking dressed up in religious language. All he had to do was decide that what he was experiencing wasn't real, that his healing was coincidence or misdiagnosis, or the kind of medical anomaly that doctors encountered occasionally and learned not to question too closely. But as he lay there in sand that smelled like roses, looking up into eyes that held depths of compassion he had never imagined possible, Jack found that he couldn't choose skepticism over wonder, couldn't choose doubt over the evidence of his own senses. The peace filling his chest was too real, the transformation in his broken body too complete, the love radiating from her presence too overwhelming to dismiss as brain chemistry or psychological projection. "I choose you," he said, the words coming from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. "I choose faith." She leaned down and kissed his forehead with lips that felt warm as summer sunlight. And in that moment, Jack Thompson, career Marine, professional skeptic, mocker of all things sacred, was born again in the most literal sense possible. Not the metaphorical rebirth that preachers talked about in air-conditioned churches, but actual death and resurrection played out on desert stone under stars that seemed to pulse with divine approval. Light exploded behind his eyelids, so brilliant it turned the world white and weightless. He felt himself lifted from the stone, not physically but spiritually, carried on currents of grace that bore him beyond pain and doubt, and the accumulated scar tissue of 30 years spent building walls around his heart. For a moment that might have lasted seconds or centuries, Jack existed in pure communion with forces that had no names in any human language, that could only be experienced as overwhelming love made manifest in forms that human consciousness could barely contain. Then darkness claimed him, gentle as sleep, peaceful as the prayers his mother had whispered over his crib before life taught her that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. When consciousness returned, Jack found himself staring up at Pierce's young face, pale with fear, and streaked with tears that cut clean tracks through dust and grime. Ramos knelt beside his right shoulder, hands moving with practiced efficiency as he checked for injuries that should have been obvious, wounds that should have painted the stone beneath them red with life bleeding away into sand. "Thompson," Ramos said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Stay with us, man." Medevac's en route. Jack sat up slowly, expecting pain that didn't come, testing limbs that should have been broken but moved with fluid grace. His right leg, which he remembered seeing twisted at an impossible angle with bone jutting through skin, felt strong and whole beneath his desert camouflage. His shoulder rotated smoothly in its socket. His head, which had struck stone with enough force to crack his skull, showed no signs of trauma beyond a fading headache that felt more like the memory of pain than pain itself. "I'm okay," he said, his voice carrying a certainty that surprised everyone present, including himself. Pierce's eyes widened as he performed the kind of rapid medical assessment he had been trained to conduct in situations where seconds could mean the difference between life and death. Pulse strong and steady. Pupils equal and reactive. No obvious signs of concussion or internal bleeding. No compound fractures or dislocated joints. No evidence of the traumatic injuries they had all witnessed when Jack's body struck the stone slope and tumbled into the gully like a rag doll thrown by an angry child. "That's impossible," Pierce whispered, his hands shaking as he checked and rechecked vital signs that should have been indicating massive trauma. "We saw you fall. We saw the blood." Jack looked down at his uniform, expecting to see fabric torn and stained with evidence of impact and injury. Instead, he found only the normal wear and dust accumulation of a day spent moving through desert terrain. No rips in the fabric where bones should have punched through. No bloodstains marking places where arteries had opened and closed again. Nothing to indicate that he had experienced anything more traumatic than a routine patrol through challenging but navigable country. But in his breast pocket, pressed against his heart, he could feel the 2 white roses. Impossible flowers that had no business blooming in desert where rainfall was measured in inches per year, and the only vegetation that survived was adapted to extremes that would kill more delicate species in hours. Physical proof of an encounter that transcended every rational explanation he might have constructed to dismiss what he had experienced. "Help me up," he said, extending his hand toward Ramos, who hesitated for a moment before gripping Jack's forearm and pulling him to his feet. Jack stood easily, his balance perfect, his legs strong beneath him, testing his weight on limbs that showed no sign of recent trauma. The radio crackled to life with sudden clarity, Base Command's voice cutting through electronic silence that had lasted for 6 days without explanation or resolution. "Desert Patrol 7, this is Command. What's your status?" Ramos looked at Jack with expression that mixed relief with bewilderment, then keyed his microphone to respond. "Command, this is Desert 7. We're all fine here. Mission proceeding normally." "Copy that, 7. Maintain your current heading and report back in 6 hours." "Roger. Command. 7 out." The radio fell silent again, but this time the silence felt natural. Not the oppressive emptiness that had swallowed their communications for the past week, but the normal quiet of desert spaces where electronic chatter was an intrusion rather than a necessity. As they gathered their equipment and prepared to continue the descent, Jack touched the roses in his pocket and felt something that had been absent from his life for so long he had forgotten its name. Hope. Not the desperate hope of childhood prayers whispered in dark bedrooms, but mature hope based on evidence he had gathered with his own senses. Proof that the universe was larger and more mysterious and infinitely more loving than he had ever dared to imagine.